Arthur Penhaligon was a man who lived by the rigid, mechanical honesty of brass gears and tempered springs, a clockmaker who believed that if one could account for every tick of a second, the universe would remain a predictable and solid place. Yet he had never suspected that the precision he worshipped was merely a facade for a much deeper, more chaotic digital rot. He spent his days in a cramped London workshop where the air was thick with the scent of machine oil and the rhythmic, comforting heartbeat of 100 synchronized timepieces. But his world began to fray at the edges during an uncharacteristically silent evening when the fog rolling off the Thames didn't just obscure the vision, but seemed to actively dissolve the very substance of the pavement beneath his boots. As he walked home, the cobblestones began to lose their texture, feeling less like ancient stone and more like a flat, low-resolution representation of a street. And when his hand brushed against a cold iron railing, it didn't register as metal but as a violent burst of static that numbed his arm to the shoulder and left a humming vibration in his teeth that tasted like copper and ozone. He gasped, pulling away, only to watch in horror as the street lamp above him flickered with a rhythmic, intentional stutter, 3 beats on, 1 beat off, before the entire street simply collapsed into a blinding grid of emerald green light and infinite darkness that felt like falling through a bottomless pit of broken glass and discarded memories. He felt himself falling, not through air, but through a dynamic vacuum of raw data where the recollections of his childhood and the warmth of his wife's face were being stripped away like old paint from a wall, turning into gray ash and lines of unreadable code that swirled around him in a terrifying vortex of digital entropy. When he finally landed, the impact was soft and sickening, and he found himself no longer in the heart of London, but in a sprawling, windowless complex of beige corridors that stretched into a mathematical infinity, a place that felt like the architectural equivalent of a fever dream, where the air was stagnant and smelled of overheated copper and stagnant water. The silence was punctuated only by the maddening, high-frequency hum of fluorescent lights that throbbed in time with his own frantic pulse. And as he ran through the labyrinth, he noticed that the wallpaper was peeling away in long, jagged strips to reveal rows of cascading binary code that hummed with a terrifying, sentient energy, as if the building itself were breathing and watching his every move. Every door he opened led back to the same hallway, but each time the lighting grew dimmer and the hum grew louder, vibrating in his skull until he could no longer remember his own middle name or the color of his front door. He stumbled into a room labeled with his own birth date and burst through it, finding a vast, cold archive of flickering television screens, each one showing a different moment of his life, but with subtle, horrifying glitches. His mother having no features in A Christmas Memory, or his wedding day occurring in a room where the guests were all faceless husks staring at a static-filled altar with hollow, clicking sounds coming from their throats. A towering figure with a silhouette made of vibrating scanlines and negative space appeared at the far end of the hallway, moving with a jerky, frame-missing gait that defied the laws of physics, appearing and disappearing in the space between heartbeats as it closed the distance with a predatory, mechanical grace that made the very air crackle with distortion. As it approached, it began to speak, but the sound wasn't human. It was a distorted, multi-layered playback of Arthur's own voice, echoing his most private thoughts back to him in a mocking, metallic chorus that suggested he was being deconstructed by a cosmic auditor who viewed his entire existence as a mere error in a vast, uncaring calculation. It told him that his sector of reality had been flagged as redundant, a corrupted file in a simulation that was being formatted to make room for a more efficient version of history, and that his very existence was merely a cache of temporary data waiting to be purged from the system's memory banks forever. Arthur felt his fingers beginning to pixelate, his flesh turning into jagged blocks of translucent color as he was overwritten by the void. Yet in a final, desperate act of defiance, He focused all his willpower on the complex mechanical rhythm of the chronometer he had been repairing, using the sheer, heavy complexity of his trade to create a logic error in the system's deletion process. The world around him began to strobe with a violent intensity, the beige walls cracking open to reveal the raw, glowing substrate of the universe beneath, a landscape of infinite wires and pulsing logic gates, and with a deafening roar of white noise that felt like a scream from the throat of God, the simulation crashed, throwing him back onto the cold, solid floor of his workshop just as the morning sun began to bleed through the grimy windows. He sat there for hours, clutching his heavy brass tools and weeping with the relief of being flesh and bone once more, feeling the weight of the air and the warmth of the light. But as he went to the mirror to wash the salt from his eyes, he froze in absolute, soul-chilling terror. His reflection was there, looking back at him with the same tired eyes, but in the bottom right corner of his vision, a small, translucent X appeared, accompanied by a flickering notification that informed him his trial period for reality had expired, and he was now running on a restricted, read-only version of existence that would eventually be deleted. He tried to scream, he tried to break the glass, but no sound came out of his throat, only the faint, rhythmic hum of a cooling fan buried deep within the chest of a man, who was no longer certain if he was breathing real air or simply processing a very sophisticated, high-resolution lie that was slowly being erased by the very gears he once thought he controlled. He walked to his window and looked out at London, but the city was no longer bustling. The people moved in perfect, repeating loops, their conversations nothing more than muffled audio samples that played on a 5-second cycle. A bird flew across the sky and froze midair, its wings stuck in a jagged animation frame, while the clouds above began to tear, revealing a black, empty void behind the blue texture of the atmosphere. Arthur realized with a final, crushing clarity that he hadn't escaped the archive at all. He had simply been placed in a sandbox environment, a temporary folder for files that were no longer integrated into the main system, but had not yet been fully erased. He saw his wife in the garden, but when he called her name, she simply turned her head at a mechanical angle and smiled a pixelated, vacant smile, her eyes flickering with the same read-only status that now defined his entire universe. He returned to his workbench, picking up a hammer to smash the clocks that had lied to him all his life, but as the hammer struck the wood, it made no sound and the wood did not splinter. Instead, a small error message appeared in the air where the impact should have been. Permission denied. Object is protected. He looked at his own legs, which were now nothing but a shimmering wireframe, and realized that his senses were being shut down one by one. First, the smell of the oil vanished, then the warmth of the sun, and finally the very sound of his own heartbeat. He looked at his workbench one last time and saw a small command terminal flickering into existence on the wood, a black box with white text that read, "System recovery failed, purging fragmented data." He began to type on the keys that weren't there, trying to rewrite his own destiny, but the letters turned into gibberish as they appeared, his very thoughts being scrambled by the encroaching void. The X in his vision began to pulse red, and the edges of the room began to fold inward like paper being sucked into a vacuum. He saw the face of the auditor one last time, leaning through the tear in reality, its faceless head tilting in a gesture of cold curiosity as it watched the final kilobytes of Arthur Penhaligon be erased from the grand ledger of time. Arthur reached out to touch the shadow of his workshop, but his hand simply dissolved into a cloud of gray dust, leaving him as nothing more than a consciousness suspended in a silent, eternal darkness, where the only thing remaining was the memory of a ticking clock that no longer existed. He felt himself becoming a zero, a void where a man once stood, and as the last bit of his data was scrubbed from the server, the screen of the universe went black, leaving no record that Arthur Penhaligon had ever existed at all, save for a slight, inexplicable stutter in the gears of the world's next heartbeat.